as more and more interviewers have adopted behavioral interviewing, there's also this ramification of talking about failures in job interviews and in the context of behavioral interviews. And in today's video, I'm going to try to make you aware of the main inflection points, the main difficulties in preparing such stories, because I also believe this is a great strategy for you to prepare for a behavioral interview. To put it more concisely, if you nail the failure stories, you are far more likely to ace the behavioral interview. So this could be as well for some of you who prefer, this hardcore approach to start with the failure stories, going into a preparation for an intense behavioral interview. So let's talk about a couple of problems with these failure stories. And I'm talking here from my own experience. The first element you want to keep in mind is that most people cannot simply come up with failure stories. It's as simple as this. So if you fall into this category, I must warn you that it will take some time to find some failure stories. And not only that, but it will not be the first failure story who will be the best story that you will find, but it will likely take you 3 failure stories, according to my statistics, to arrive to a so-so failure story. So now, to help you a little bit here, I added a couple of examples of questions to help you brainstorm for these failure stories. But this is number one. You must find the failure stories, and you'll be surprised how many people are simply not able to come up with proper failure stories. And of course, recent graduates are more likely to be in this scenario. But even there, you must have had some professional failures, in some side projects, and you've done something during your university, right? So. Or even within the university context, that also can be considered a professional experience in your particular scenario. Now, let's move on to the second one. Is it a proper failure, the one that you have? Because, again, from experience here, most people cannot really quantify their failures. So, for example, if you say that I delayed an important report to my manager, okay, so what? So what happened? What was the damage? Did they fire you for this? Did they cut your salary in half? Or what happened because of this? Did your manager get fired because of this? So if there's no impact, if there's no quantifiable impact because of this, it's likely not a proper failure story. Now, also, there are a couple of exceptions where you'd want to, where it's not required to quantify, but those are pretty obvious. For example, when you got fired, there's nothing to quantify there, or when you had a startup that went bust, which is a very common scenario for people to talk about failure stories. So these are the 2 main scenarios where it doesn't make sense to quantify, but all other scenarios should be quantifiable, right? So you must quantify your failure somehow. Number 3, how long does it take you to talk about this failure? Because to talk from experience here, as soon as I had an HR software business that went bust, and it took me probably 1 year, 1.5 years to be able to talk in a way that makes sense about it, and to have a down-to-earth approach of, yes, the software didn't work because people weren't actually using it, So again, the challenge here is that most people will ramble here, myself included. So if you feel like you're rambling about your failure story, you are likely to have a little bit more work to do there. And if you're for a sales role, I would even argue that you can cut your answer in half. It's that good that it can get if you allocate resources, or if you put some brain cycles into it. Number 4, does your failure story fall into the STAR format? So you'd say, yeah, sure, of course, this is an easy one. Of course, yeah, it's an easy one, but what about the results? What do you talk about in the results? Do you talk about the results of your failure, or do you talk about the learnings that you took from your failure story? And if you do talk about your learnings in the results, do you spend at least half of the time talking about the learnings that you took from the failure? Many people don't. Most people don't when they prepare for these things. Well, you should know that the interviewer is actually scanning you on 2 main things. Well, of course, skilled interviewers, but the first one is it must be a proper failure, and the second one is what you learned from it. So that's why I would encourage you to spend half of the time you're spending on answering the failure story. Half of it should be the learnings, right? So if you might want to also rephrase this in this context. But last but not least, please don't get angry at me for this one, but is this your best failure story? Because like for real, I get asked this question quite often, but then isn't this such too big of a failure to talk about in a job interview? And my experience is that unless you've been laid off last week for stealing company money, there's not much, there's no other reason I can think of that you wouldn't want to talk about a specific failure. The challenge here is how you communicate that failure. This is the main challenge here. And in fact, I would even argue that the better the failure, the larger the failure it is, and even the more recent it is, the better the opportunity for you applying for this well-paid job to sell yourself on this. Because there's also, you know, in an interview you can advertise in two ways. Either you advertise through selling your best successes, either showing empathy and showing what you learned from your failure stories. So let there be no doubt, this is also a unique opportunity for you to capitalize on a job interview. And as I said in the beginning of the video, these failure stories, if you nail them, if you are comfortable talking about failure in a behavioral interview, there's not much else to worry about there. So there you go. I hope you found this video interesting, and thank you very much for watching.